Hey guys, this is chess coach Andrew Rankin, back with our fourth video in the series, Buffing Your Black Repertoire. Today's game is another Caro Kann. This time, however, we play the advanced variation. This game was an over-the-board game played in Spokane, Washington at the Collier Memorial Tournament in 2022. I was paired as black against a 2050 expert-rated player. So of course, a Caro Kann starts with e4, c6, d4, d5, and the advanced variation, e5. And now, most grandmasters I think would agree that the safest and most solid way to play is bishop f5. An alternative would be pawn to c5, but I don't really buy it. So I play bishop to f5, he plays knight to f3, e6, closing the pawn chain, bishop to e2. This is called the short variation. So now we're playing the Caro Kann advanced short variation. And what white is saying with this move is that black has a serious space disadvantage with this pawn on e5, and it's going to be difficult for him to develop his pieces and find good squares. So white is simply saying, let's see how you solve your problem. I don't have to do anything crazy to make life unpleasant for you. So I play knight b to d7. I should note that there are really two options here. You can play c5 right away, or you can develop your pieces and prepare c5 a little bit more. So I played the move knight b to d7. Other options are knight to e7. You could play the move a6. Those are really your standard options. I like to prepare the move c5, and I also like to play the move knight b to d7. He castles, and now I play knight to e7. The idea is that I'm going to play c5, and then this knight is going to come to c6, and this knight is going to reroute to the queen side, possibly to b4, and we're going to play on the queen side, which is where our pawn structure is telling us to play. My opponent played knight b to d2. I played c5, and now my opponent played c3. I should note that really white should play the move c4. You're going to face the move c3 most, and that's why I think this video is very educational for you. But really what white should be doing is playing the move c4. And the reason is because we're taking 2 and sometimes 3 tempos to get these knights to good squares. And so white should be ripping open the center since he has a lead in development. His king is castled and our king is not. c3, however, keeping the position closed, and therefore black is comfortable to continue maneuvering his pieces. Knight to c6. My opponent plays knight to b3, and I put my bishop on e7. I love this square for my bishop, and I'm preparing to castling. Now my opponent plays knight takes c5, and this is a fundamental mistake. It's not a losing mistake. It does give black equality, but it's a fundamental mistake because it violates all the principles that white should be adhering to in this opening. First of all, white has a space advantage, so he should not be trading pieces, making things easier for black. Second of all, he should not allow black to trade his bad piece. This knight is terrible. It's going to take black a long time to figure out how to activate this knight and make it a good piece. But playing knight takes c5 allows knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, and all of a sudden black has reached equality. Not to mention, the third principle that white violated here was that he spent 3 tempos doing this. So white lost a tempo by doing this. My opponent continues with bishop to f4. And this is really a clear indicator that the short variation is not an opening that you should play lightly. This is something that you should play if you really know what you're doing. If you don't, I highly recommend you don't play the short variation. Because my opponent is rated 2050 USCF, an expert-rated player not far away from a master. And he clearly does not know the ideas in the short variation. Now, if we do a piece comparison, these knights are about equal, fighting for the same center squares. This bishop is better than this bishop. This bishop is better than this bishop. And the queens and rooks are about the same. So here black is already better by half a point. Black doesn't have to do anything, just castling. Now bishop to d3. Realizing he doesn't really have a game plan, most people will resort to trading pieces when they don't know what to do. Knowing that my opponent doesn't really have a game plan, I didn't want to trade pieces. The Caro Kann pawn structure is known for being solid and a advantageous endgame pawn structure, but I'm not really looking to trade off pieces and possibly just make a draw. I want to play for a win. And so I'm going to set a little trap here. Bishop to g4, pinning the knight, and offering him the option of playing bishop takes h7. It looks like white can play this Greek gift, because if takes knight here and we move the king away, he has queen takes bishop, and white just wins a pawn. So it looks like a winning tactic. But here, after knight to g5, find the move for black that wins material and probably the game. Hopefully you guys found the move queen takes knight. The idea is that if bishop takes queen, then bishop takes queen. And if he moves his queen, I'll move my queen. And we're simply up. I think this is the best example. Takes, takes. Takes. We simply have two minor pieces to his one, and black is much better here. So I was hoping my opponent would fall for this. I don't even think he looked for it, because he played the move h3 pretty quickly, questioning my bishop. I dropped the bishop back, and now he lashes out with the move g4. And the reason I say lash out is because usually when your opponents make a dubious move in the opening and they concede equality, later in the middle game, when they realize they haven't gotten anything out of the opening, they'll lash out with a move that creates weaknesses and possibly doesn't really help their position, but only makes it worse. And so here his king is now really weak, and I think my bishop is getting even stronger on this beautiful a7 to g1 diagonal. I drop the bishop back, he takes, and now we really need to decide which pawn to take with. 9 times out of 10, I'd be taking with the h-pawn, keeping my solid pawn structure and loving it. But in this case, we should play the move f takes g6. The reason is because without moving the f rook, we've now put it on a beautiful half-open f file, and we force his bishop to move. He could play the move bishop to g5, but then we just play the move queen to b6, which we wanted to go anyway, attacking key weaknesses in white's position. So my opponent simply backed the bishop to g3, keeping everything solid. This knight, however, is a little bit loose, and my pieces are starting to look stronger and stronger. I put the second rook on the second half-open file, which is the c file. So now I have some really strong pieces. We do a piece comparison. I think all of black's pieces are better now. My opponent plays king to g2, just solidifying the knight with an extra defender and getting out of this pin. I play the move queen to b6, putting pressure on b2, hoping to incite b3. My idea is now to get the move b3 played, so I can play against the weak c3 pawn. He plays queen to b3, and now I play knight to a5. I want to get this knight to c4, and I want to facilitate a queen trade, which allows me to get my bishop off the c file and continue with my plan of attacking c3. He takes, I take, just as I wanted. He plays rook to c1, defending the c-pawn so that he can move this guy when it's attacked, which I do, and now he plays the move b3. I was very happy to see this move because now c3 is weak, and I'm ready to attack it. I play the move knight to a3, wanting to go back to b5 and putting more pressure on c3. Now he starts to attack. He realizes that if he just sits back, black actually has some pretty simple game plans, and black is probably just going to win a pawn and then slowly grind out the victory. So he attacks my e6 pawn, really the only weakness in my position, and he's hoping for a move like rook f to e8 or rook c to e8. This would be passive defense, and this is not what we want to do. Instead, we should play rook to c6, keeping pressure on the weakness and laterally defending our pawn. He plays f4 now, making his g4 pawn thrust a little bit more logical. He has a kingside pawn storm. He does not have a kingside pawn majority, so this is a game plan, but I'm not really sure if it's a winning game plan. The computer obviously doesn't like it and calls this an inaccuracy. And the reason is because we can kick the knight with h6. Knight goes back to f3, and now I'm going to pause my video, and hopefully you guys can find a nice material winning tactic for black. Alright, hopefully you guys found the move bishop to e3. We're attacking the rook, and we're also double attacking the f4 pawn. Realizing that if he just plays normal moves, We're going to trade off bishops. He's going to be down a pawn and possibly going to lose this pawn in the future, and white has no compensation to show. So he needs to create dynamic counterplay, and doing that usually means sacrificing a little bit of material or sacrificing exchange to make the game dynamic and imbalanced. He plays the move f5. Obviously, the computer calls that a blunder, but you'll be surprised at how many threats white can create with this move. So I thought for a long time here, not knowing whether I should take the pawn or take the exchange. I decided to trade off my doubled pawns, realizing that if he moves the rook, I can take, and I'll be just up a pawn in a better endgame, and the material is still balanced. And when the material is balanced, the position is symmetrical and you're up material, it's usually pretty easy to convert. So he took back, doubling down on his idea. Bishop takes rook, rook takes, and now pawn takes. So we're up the exchange and we're also up a pawn, but his pieces finally get active. Knight to d4. I drop the rook back to c8 with the idea of over defending my back rank, so this pass pawn is not going to be a threat at any point in this game. Now his idea is that he wants to play the move e6, bishop d6, forking my pieces, and my knight has no squares to go. My knight is actually trapped right now, so I have to be very careful that I don't end up giving back all of the material that I've won and simply up an exchange but down a whole piece. So he plays the move bishop to f4, and he realizes that e6 doesn't work because it's met with f4, shutting the door in his face. So first he has to prevent me from shutting the door, but this move is too slow. I could have played the move g5 right away, but instead I really want to solve my problems. Safety chess first. a6, giving my knight an escape square. He plays e6, threatening bishop to d6. I move my knight to b5, solving my problems and offering a trade. I say, hey, you want to trade into a losing endgame? Let's do it. He declines the trade, probably the smart choice, but now he loses a second pawn. Knight takes c3. He moves his knight back to d4, which is a pretty smart move because I'm threatening knight to e2, forking his bishop and his rook, trading into a simple rook versus knight and rook and up in 2 pawns endgame, and I think that would be pretty easy to convert. So I decide to centralize my knight and offer a rook trade. He has this cute move, knight takes f5, the idea that if I take his knight, then he'll take my rook with check, and if I take his rook, which is what I played, he has the in-between move, knight to e7, check. I'm going to move my king to h7, and the reason is because if we go to h8, then the knight forks us here with check, and he can decide whether to take this rook or this rook, and we give him too much counterplay and too many options. He takes my rook on c1, and now I drop my knight back to f6. I just want to guard my pass pawn so that at least his biggest asset, I have the same thing right next to it. He has a pass pawn, I have a pass pawn. He decides to play bishop to a3, threatening knight takes d5 and a discovered attack on my bishop. Rook to e8, attacking the knight, as well as threatening to win the e-pawn if he ever moves his knight. He decides to bring his king towards the center. I play g5. My idea is simply that I want to create 2 pass pawns, one on the d file and one on the g file, to overload his king. His king can't stop both pawns. So he brings his king closer to the center. h5 with the idea of pushing g4. King to f3, g4 anyway, pawn takes, king comes to f4, and I push my pawn to d4. And I actually have 2 ideas here. One is runaway pass pawns, and the second is a nice tactic I'm going to have you guys find right now. Bishop c5, and now find the game-winning tactic. Alright, hopefully you found the move rook takes e7. My opponent resigned here, because let's look at what happened if he took the rook. Bishop takes, knight check fork, king takes, knight takes, king comes over, king comes up, king comes over, looking to win my pawn. We say nope, we're going to hold on to that. He pushes, and we're just in time to catch the pawn with our king. Black is going to be up a pawn as well as a whole knight, in a completely winning endgame with no compensation for white. So hopefully you guys see how important it is to emphasize fundamental principles in the opening. Violating them and you will be regretting it the entire game. Alright guys, hope you found that educational, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks. Bye.